The most productive thing I think INET can do in terms of promoting economics for the future is to continue the work that it's doing for the next generation through the YSI initiative. My name's Sheila Dow. I'm an Emeritus Professor at University of Stirling in Scotland and also an Adjunct Professor at University of Victoria in Canada. The Scottish Enlightenment has many facets, but the one that's most important as far as I'm concerned is the way of thinking. The way in which Adam Smith and David Hume developed their thinking was the education system. At that stage, students would start university age 12, 13, 14, and everybody was required to study moral philosophy first before anything else, which was critical because that meant that everything else was taught presuming a knowledge of moral philosophy. And of course we know that the social sciences emerged out of that teaching itself. And the second thing was, partly because of Scotland's history, that everything was taught historically, so that rather than teaching the latest idea as being by definition the best idea, what was taught was the different ideas in philosophy or physics, mathematics, at different points in history and in different places, so that students got the idea that a particular context would throw up a way of thinking that was suited to that context, which one understood best in that context, and then would compare with ideas from other contexts. And both of these things, the foundation in moral philosophy and the historical approach to teaching, were critical to the way in which Smith and Hume's thinking developed. On the one hand, it's good to draw out of these different experiences some principles, like Smith's division of labour principle, which he could see playing out from ancient history, variety of contexts, contemporary contexts, and so on. But that this shouldn't be treated as a universal theory to be applied in all circumstances in exactly the same way. That you draw out these principles from detailed historical study as a way of trying to approach a modern context to help you think about it. But it's a provisional principle. You look at the context you're studying in detail and have to form a view about how to apply the principle, how it might take on a different shape within that modern context. And it's that combination of generality and specificity that is so important, I think, in their approach. People interpret Adam Smith as having a universal principle of markets, whereas in fact he had a very nuanced analysis of markets. So that, for example, free trade might be a reasonable starting point, but he had many exceptions where he felt that protection was justified by infant industries, or if there's to create a level playing field, you had to protect against some other kind of restriction. His political economy came out of his ideas on jurisprudence. What he'd looked at was the way in which societies more generally evolved to the latest commercial stage. And he saw the state as something that was part and parcel of the evolution of societies, just as markets were part and parcel of the evolution of societies. And he saw the state and markets as interacting, being mutually supportive, and not being antagonistic. There's this sort of habit now to separate, sort of the state on one side, markets on the other, and near the twain shall meet. That wasn't the way he thought about it at all. Now, if we think of the Institute for Economic Affairs or the Adam Smith Institute, who claim Adam Smith as a very pro-market thinker, they look back to Hayek, who was very much influenced by the Scottish Enlightenment. On the other hand, you have people like Heilbronner, who took a very sort of left-wing interpretation of Adam Smith. Marx was influenced by Adam Smith and David Hume, all in different ways. And in a way, this is characteristic of a great thinker, that people will take different interpretations and run with them. And in each case, took what I would call a political economy interpretation, which is in the spirit of the Scottish Enlightenment, But it's really modern economics in its mainstream form, I think, that's, I mean, because it's not a political economy approach, has taken a very specific approach which involves separations, a particular view of human behaviour, separation between market and state and so on, which became a sort of characteristic of modern economics, that the individual was thought of as rational economic man. I'm reminded of something I read recently in a review of a book by Richard Thaler, where the reviewer was saying we all have a propensity to truck, barter and exchange, which was something Adam Smith said. But we're all lousy at it because we become confused by social norms and by other regarding behaviour, which is a classic statement of the Adam Smith problem, because of course for Adam Smith we truck, barter and exchange within society, and trucking, barter and exchange requires social norms to work and other regarding behaviour. We try to get in the head of the person who's selling to us to get an idea of what they'll regard as a sort of reasonable, morally acceptable offer, and vice versa. Now, this of course is very different in modern society, but I mean, we can still translate that into behaviour. I've read accounts of trading floors and, you know, anonymous exchanges with dealers over the internet where social norms still are very important. People are blackballed if they violate these norms. So there is a modern version of what Adam Smith was talking about. It's not solely something that happens in the hay market or the grass market. When I was first taught political economy many years ago, in those days, it was still the case that students had to study moral philosophy or logic and metaphysics in their first year before they proceeded to other subjects. And so political economy started off with history of thought and methodology. Ultimately, the main contribution, I think, is the way of thinking. What does science mean for a social science? I mean, that leads to an argument for a pluralistic way of approaching knowledge, which means respecting that there may be a range of approaches to knowledge because the social world is so complex that no one approach is going to be sufficient, and that there's virtue in having a range of possibilities, and a pluralist methodology drawing on different types of argument, not pure mathematical modelling, but other types of argument, which of course other economists do. I mean, this is McCloskey's big argument. This is, in practice, economists don't just stick to models, but that's what goes into the formal discourse. Pluralism includes mainstream economics, and the idea of the trade-off is a mainstream concept. There are lots of questions around, lots of questioning of economists. I mean, part of this fake experts issue was prompted by a questioning of economic expertise. So the questions are out there. The standard way to teach is to say, people used to think this, but now they think that. And this is because there are all these problems with the old way of thinking. Instead, teaching by debate would be to present a set of ideas, explain why people think that way, and what the pros and cons are. Present another set of ideas, explain why people think that way, pros and cons, and then encourage the students themselves to get involved in debate. You know, if you start off respecting students and their capacity to form opinions, then you can start helping them, giving them the material to develop that. And once they've got that idea, then there's so much that's possible. Then it becomes transformative. I mean, the last thing I want to advocate is teaching students to think one way rather than another. I just want to think of them being taught in such a way that they can form their own views and then defend them, other points of view, other schools of thought. And I think the most important thing actually is the way in which the Young Scholars Initiative is operating alongside other organisations like Rethinking Economics, Reteaching Economics. All these organisations are taking a pluralistic approach, and this is the new generation. I mean, this is an illustration of what I was talking about, that if you give students the opportunity and the direction and the ideas, they're forming all these virtual networks. They're meeting amongst themselves, exchanging ideas, supporting each other. While I wouldn't have been optimistic a while back, I'm much more optimistic now, because I think there is a groundswell behind thinking about things differently, opening it up.